The last topic then for our ecology unit is ecological succession. And succession is all about changes that are happening within an ecosystem. And so really what we're talking about here is changing from one type of habitat to a new habitat. This happens as one stage of succession prepares the local habitat for the next stage to basically take over. So succession is a very predictable process. If you know the climate and basically the biome type that you would expect, you're able to predict a series of changes that will occur in a community over time. And these are changes both to the plant and animal life within the community. Pictured here is a set of changes that start, and then you're looking through different time periods, time period 1, 2, 3, etc. And so one type of succession is basically going from bare rock all the way through to a forest type community. And this is predictable down to the point where if you know the climate and some other information about the ecosystem, you can even talk about the number of years that this will occur. So how many years for succession to take place in a particular area. So as these sets of changes happen, scientists will take different measures of the community. One measure of a community is called its biodiversity. And so biodiversity is a measure of the number of species in an area. So basically any area that has more species has greater biodiversity. Rainforests and coral reefs are often examples used of areas with lots of biodiversity. And so what scientists have noticed is this, that over time, the number of species in an area generally increases. That's assuming that there's no forest fires or natural disasters or anything like that that would set succession back. And so this happens as the complexity within the ecosystem builds. Basically, what's happening with succession is that each species prior to the climax stage alters the environment and makes it less favorable for itself and more favorable for species that are going to come along afterwards. And so succession happens as basically one species gets the community ready for a new types of organisms to take over. It's a gradual change, especially in the soil. Succession is soil is really important in succession, and some other abiotic factors will change also. Things maybe you could think of things like humidity, things like soil pH, stuff like that are being altered based on the presence of different plants and things like that. We'll be examining succession in two different ways. We'll first look at what's called primary succession, and then we'll take a look at secondary. Primary succession is the set of changes that occurs as an area goes from having no prior ecosystem, so no ecosystem is present ever in this area, at least in geologic time, through to the different communities. And so primary succession is detailed over here, kind of zigzags 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then 6 would be the order of these photos. And this is a pretty slow process. This could take hundreds of thousands of years depending on the climate, the community type, whether any more disturbances are happening. But basically you're starting from no community. Usually what we're talking about here when there's no ecosystem present, think rock. You're starting with rocks and you're turning rocks, a field of rocks, into a forest. Instances or examples of when this might actually happen in nature: after lava flows or volcanic islands form, after glaciers recede, after city streets are left or no longer maintained, roads. I've hiked in New Mexico along an old piece of highway that hadn't been maintained in about 40 years, and it was all crumbled and broken down, and there were cacti growing on it and things like that. So that would be an example of primary succession. So primary succession, in order for us to consider it to be primary succession, it's always happening starting without any soil. Okay, so that's key. So no soil. Like we said before, volcanic activity can lead to this. Landslides, glacial recession, those are big times when you would see primary succession. And primary succession is always going to start with the arrival of a special type of living organism. And these organisms, because they're arriving in an area that has no other community, you're not going to get a predator or an herbivore as your first species to arrive. Why? Well, those things would need something else to eat, a food web to rely on. So the first things that move into an ecosystem are always going to be autotrophs, first of all, so they have to be able to feed themselves. And they have to be able to live on no or very little soil. And we tend to call these things a pioneer species. So just like you guys think of pioneers as the people that first moved out west, even though there were Native Americans there before they arrived, they were the quote-unquote first. The pioneer species is a first type of organism to start to live in an area after the volcanic activity or the landslide or the glacial recession. So these pioneer species, they're the very first organisms to arrive, and they're typically able to grow in an area with literally no soil. So some of the best examples of pioneer species, something that I've talked to you about before, are lichens. Remember, lichens are a symbiotic relationship, a mutualistic relationship between two different types of organisms. There's an algae, a cyanobacteria, and there's a fungi that work together, and they enable these lichens to grow places like on bare rocks, on tree bark, on the sides of maple grove, as I've shown you. And so they're really the first species or the first type of organism, the first group of organisms that can move into an area after that disturbance or as it opens up and becomes available for living things to occupy. There's a couple other types of pioneer species. You can think of anywhere that starts off as sand, like this beach or sand dune. That's an opportunity for primary succession. Sand is not soil, sand is mineral. And so any species that can get in there and start to live, it's going to be the first along the way. So that's some dune grass there. This is a fireweed. It's growing on a relatively recent lava flow. It grows in the crack because that's where some wind-blown debris would have accumulated, some soil-like material to support that plant's growth. So what you should be thinking about is, if succession is a set of changes in which one group of organisms creates a new habitat or a new environment for a new group of organisms to move into, how do lichens change the habitat or get it ready for the next set of living things? And the neat thing that lichens can do is they can form soil basically by helping to erode the rock so the fungus can secrete some acids and things like that. And then they just can catch wind-blown debris from weathering and catch little tiny pieces of rock. And then when those lichens die, they decompose and add organic material to the rock. And so if you have mineral plus organic material, what you now have is soil. And other plants, new plants, are now going to be able to grow in that soil where before we just had bare rock. So lichens are over years, we're talking decades here, can accumulate enough soil that other organisms could then move in. So what's next? All right, well, what type of organism is typically found growing on rocks? You guys didn't know about lichens probably before bio. So what else is there? And your answer is going to be moss. So this is just a look at that lichen. So this, all these sort of gray patches, these are mineral deposits and lichens mixed in. This is a bare rock area. This would uh, basically be visible bedrock. And then there's a depression that's formed here, and some lichen and other organic debris is accumulated, and now you can see that there's actually a little bit of soil, and we're starting to get green plants. So the lead-in was basically what's next. So after lichen, basically we get mosses and ferns. And you guys all know moss can grow in rock. And so these are organisms that can grow in very new soil, very shallow soil. That's key. The soil's not going to be very deep here right after lichen. So you have to have some plant that's going to be a shallow rooting plant. Still plant. Now, this is probably the first time that we're really going to see some animals, some insects, other small animals might have arrived and start occupying our ecosystem. Up next, as organic material continues to accumulate, so those simple plants, those mosses and ferns die, they add more and more organic material, which equals more soil, deeper soil. That's key. Soil's key here. Grasses, wildflowers can start to move in. You might call this now a field. This process continues. Soil accumulation will continue. We'll now see shrubs and trees move in. Remember, what's increasing with time is the number of species in an area. That's an equivalent, or that's a measure of a term that we call biodiversity. So we definitely, if you look at this picture and imagine comparing it back to our lichen, we have a lot more species in this sort of shrubland, maybe some sapling trees, than we did prior back when we had bare rock. Now, how long did this take? If we were really starting with bare rock and no soil, this probably could have taken anywhere from 50 to 200 years. Really dependent on the conditions in the area, the growing season, rates of weathering, how close seeds were. So if this is happening in an area where you've got seeds nearby to start these plants off, then it's going to happen more quickly. It's happening in an area that's very remote, some kind of volcanic island, it's going to be much, much more slowly. So throughout all these sets of changes, more and more living things are going to be moving in, and the community is going to get more complex. So more diversity equals more complexity within the food web, more things for all organisms to eat, but also more things that are going to be interested in consuming them. So this is an example of terrestrial primary succession, and this is in a temperate forest community. Right? This is obviously, we're going to look at it in a little bit, but succession doesn't happen the same everywhere. But we're being shown here some different time snaps as we go through sort of some different sets of communities. You'll notice that even after we get trees, there's still some more changes that happen. So just because you arrive at large plants doesn't mean that you're going to be done. Succession without any new interruptions is always going to tend to work towards something that we're going to learn is called a climax community. That's a final stable community that will form when there's no longer any more disturbances. It's the end product of succession. So that really depends on where you're at in the local climate. The climax community in our area is a temperate deciduous forest. But that's still pretty general. There's actually, depending on where you're at, temperate deciduous forests that are dominated by maple and oak trees versus temperate deciduous forests that might be dominated by birch or willow. And so that's really down to sort of climate zones and soil type and things like that. So the really neat thing about a climax community is succession kind of really slows down. or stops. And they're actually stable. So now we're not changing anymore. And so once you reach this state, basically there's no new type of organism that can move in and take over. So how does a grass take over from a moss? Well, grass grows taller than the moss. It shades out the moss, grows and can overtake. It grows more quickly than the moss. So grass can grow over moss. By the time you get to a climax community, the types of species that are present and controlling the area aren't easily pushed out. Think redwood forest. You've got trees that are 300 feet tall, a couple thousand years old. There's not another type of tree that's going to move in and overshadow those trees or take more water than those trees can take up through the soil. And so while an individual redwood may die, other redwoods are going to be growing up to take their place. And so it's a very stable ecosystem. But climax communities are not always large trees. It can be different depending on the ecosystem. So if we're in the American Midwest, we might have a prairie climax community, seasonal grasses. We could have a desert climax community with saguaro and prickly pear cactuses. This is more of a lodgepole pine climax community you might find in some mountains in the American Southwest. So this is really dependent on your local climate. And this is kind of that idea, it ties right in with biomes. We talked about biomes, different ecosystems present in different areas on the planet. Well, your climax community in one area is going to be very different than your climax community in another. That's what creates the biome. Now that was all primary succession. The other type of succession is called secondary. And secondary is pretty straightforward. Okay? Primary, you start with bare rock. It's the first type of succession. Secondary, it's up next. What's happening here is it's a set of changes the community is following a disturbance of a previously existing community. So you already had a forest present. Some big disturbance comes along and kills most everything, and now we're going to see another set of changes. The key thing with secondary succession is it's much quicker, happens much more quickly than primary, and the key thing or reason why is we already have soil. Okay, so we don't have to develop that organic material that allows for more complex living things to grow. So some types of things that would lead to secondary succession are things like forest fires, ponds and wetlands as they fill in and accumulate sediment, hopefully not Chautauqua Lake, but maybe Chautauqua Lake. Fallow fields or yards after people stop mowing or plowing. You've all seen old abandoned houses on the side of the road with trees growing up through them. And so basically we have some sort of disturbance that disrupts the ecosystem, and then we go through the set of changes. The stage that we can basically skip is there's no bare rock or lichen stages in secondary succession. So we can start off right away with the grasses. So the fire happens, within the next year, grasses and ferns are growing, and then we're working back towards that same climax community. And so primary succession, remember I said might have taken 200 plus years. Secondary succession is usually going to take 100 to 150, depending on your ecosystem type. These are just some pictures that show some different examples of secondary. This is a field that a farmer stopped plowing. So we're now into the sort of the shrubland type of ecosystem. We'd expect we'd be able to find, foxes and rabbits, deer, and we can see at least 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different types of plants probably in this picture pretty easily. This is looking at a pond that's filling in. So sediment accumulates in layers, leading to the formation of sedimentary materials. Eventually could be sedimentary rocks. but as it fills in, you get fresh new soil. This could also be soil deposited by a river, like in a delta after a flood. Okay, so you get a lot of new soil that comes in, and then you're going to work through grasses and shrubs, and then back to forest, probably if you're in our type of area. And then we've got fire. So both these are examples of a forest fire after recent burns. So this is about this picture here. This is like an aspen forest out west. This is about 3 years post-fire. So you can see all the mature trees are dead. They're going to be falling, decomposing, etc. But we've got seedlings growing up now, grasses and ferns. This is down below. This is a fire that would be in the southeast, like Florida, Georgia, etc. These are palmetto palms. So the fire is burnt. This type of palm is a fire-adapted species. It's one of the first species to recover after a burn. So that wraps up our notes for the succession unit. Got lots of materials available on the website to help you get ready for your test.